This is The Naked Life with Roxanne Noor. Hello everyone. Today I am here with Sofia Cossar. We will be speaking about feminism, and she is really the right person to have this conversation with because she's worked in public international law around human rights, gender equality, inclusion. She has joined an intersectional feminist firm called Capitalism and started a PhD in legal theory, technology, and she's applied this to identity, citizenship, and inclusion. And all of these things have been accomplished while traveling the world for the past 10 years. We met on an island in Thailand where we've had sparks of conversations around these topics, but now we're getting to do it, and I'm super glad to be here with you.
Yay!
Yeah. And I was thinking about the fact that before I'm an American, before I'm the child of immigrants, before I have brown skin, I feel being a woman has provided the most context of my life. Being a woman is what has really given my life its flavor. And I want to talk about what being a woman means, what feminism means. And what we've seen nowadays in mainstream media is a lot of polarization and a lot of cherry picking feminists who are extremely radical and really not giving a wholesome or full name to what feminism actually is. And I want to have a conversation that's really grounded in reality. And you've worked in male-dominated spaces like government and technology, and you also have this background in intersectionality. And so I want to start by really defining what feminism actually is.
Okay, cool. I think the first aspect of feminism that we all have to be aware of is that it is a historical, very complex, and ever-evolving movement of people. And feminists fight with each other a lot, even up to today, meaning that it's not a very cohesive necessarily movement, but there is an underlying sentiment that what we're striving for is equality of rights and opportunities for all people, regardless of their gender. That is sort of like the minimum agreement that we have. And maybe it's good to pay a look at history to understand how this has evolved throughout time. So initially, what we call the first wave of feminism, which started out in the beginning of the 20th century, everything was about making women able to vote, right? It was the right to vote. And then in the 60s, 70s, the conversation moved from civil and political rights to socio-economic and cultural rights. And what we were striving for was related to reproductive health, equality in the workplace, bringing awareness about domestic violence. And from the second wave, we passed on to the 90s, more or less, with the third wave, what we call intersectional feminism. And this word has become quite popular recently. Intersectional feminism was all about deconstructing the more biologicist or essentialist, purist approach to defining what a woman is. So it basically said, okay, a woman is not only a body that is assigned female at birth, it can be a plethora of things. And in doing so, it also acknowledged that the marginalized group that you're trying to protect is more nuanced. So power and oppression feels differently depending not only on your sexual characteristics or gender identity, but also sexual orientation and your religion and your race or ethnicity, making the point that, a white woman in America is not suffering the same type of pain as the transgender black woman in the Global South. And then finally, the newest wave of feminism, the fourth wave, moved the attention to methods of resistance And that included internet activism to bring awareness about, sexism. And it all started out with the Me Too movement and continued up to now to, similar awareness raising, collectives. So that is to say, it's a very complex movement. And I think while we all agree that the end goal is to promote equality of rights and opportunities, then the differences can be summarized in like two fields. Number one is, how do you define the marginalized group? And number two is, what are the methods that you think are the best to achieve what you're trying to achieve?
Yeah, and I think that's where it gets tricky, is the implementation of how we get there. So I think, as you said, we can both agree that the experience of a Black trans person versus a white woman is very different, just based on race, classism, all these various things outside of just gender. So what would you say are the methods you've seen in working towards this inclusive intersectional lens, and what methods have you seen in the culture that don't really work?
I think this is a very personal take, and it is something that has put me in trouble several times. So I will try to be very delicate in the way I explain this point. But I think it's fair to say, with every disruptive movement, you have three core methods. And they don't need to be mutually exclusive, but you can differentiate them. So the first one is, let's set everything on fire, right? Like, let's wage war. Let's start like an armed revolution. And I think, like, there is a time and a place for that, and it plays a role, definitely. The second one, which became more prominent, particularly in the West, ever since, the end of the Cold War, is, let's try to lobby governments to pass, better laws and better policies to promote gender inclusion, sort of like gender diversity and inclusion. And I think, we can all agree that it's absolutely necessary to have good laws and good policies. However, what I am seeing is that we have not paid enough attention to the third method, which is conversational, which is trying to win and sort of first deconstruct and second win the hearts and the minds of people. And what happens is, if you solely focus on the second one, on laws and policies, without the third one, what you create usually is a lot of resentment. So law and policies by themselves never work. I give you an example. So I think, obviously we need, and we're seeing that a lot, countries that are making, legal for non-heterosexual couples to get married within a state's jurisdiction. But, like, even in my country, in Argentina, then you may go to Christmas and then you see your grandma. And then at some point of the night, your grandma is like, oh, these gay people that are getting married, like they shouldn't do it. This is like the decay of civilization. And I've been there, and I know a lot of my colleagues have been there, where you're in that situation, and then, you get offended, and then you either tell your grandma that she's a homophobe, or you just don't reply, you don't engage in the conversation. And I think that's when we start losing. And that's where we've lost the hearts and the minds of people, because that is such a beautiful opportunity to engage in a conversation of, okay, grandma, tell me why do you think the gays shouldn't get married? I want to hear your position. And most of the times, unless grandma is a total psychopath or a total sociopath, she actually means well. It's just that the statement is based on fear and ignorance. And, laws and politics alone cannot undo fear or ignorance. So I think, like, true activism is it's a fucking tedious 24/7 energy draining exercise, but that's why we choose to be activists in the first place. And that is something that I think is missing, and that is highly effective in the long term to make, gender equality and inclusion something that is a reality.
Yeah, and I think what you point to that's so important is the fact that it does require a lot of energy, and it is this commitment to consciously be there again and again, and to go past our own feelings of righteousness. And I think what we see in public discourse and dialogue in general is that really hard frame of reality. And especially when it involves human rights and it feels like a personal attack. Yeah, if you're gay, if you're a woman, it's so easy to get into this triggered state. And there's a lot of movements that have spun out for inclusion, for accountability. For example, you touched on before, just even the Me Too movement was a huge example of this. We want to have public discourse about things. And what we see a lot is either people getting exiled from conversation, so a whole person gets canceled, or it's not a real conversation. And so with things that are so difficult to speak about, things like, yeah, equal rights, not being sexually harassed at work, what are there any cases, because you've been in law and policy and all these things, are there any cases you've seen that were admirable, or things you think have worked really well, where it's people actually listening? Because it's easier to have these conversations one-on-one with someone you love, like your grandma or a new friend. For even me, I have a lot of friends who are actually conservatives, and I like this because it creates a diversity in my mind of thought and not being stuck in an echo chamber of my own kind of more liberal education. And so are there any things you've actually seen in the public sphere where you're like, wow, this is a dialogue and this is happening?
That's such a good point. I think, like, yeah, it is very important to make a difference between acts of violence, right? Like, if a person is being violent and attacking us, of course, that is not a time and a place to engage in deconstructive conversation, right? So obviously, we have to be, careful that, this doesn't imply that there is like complete moral relativism and a lack of awareness on situations that actually require like swift centralized action of enforcement of law and policies. But I feel, and this feeling came to me when I moved to Copangan and being in contact with tantra, which somehow it usually feels that it's at odds with activism. I tell you why. Because usually people think that you can have accountability or reconciliation. You can't have both. And Tantra is inspiring more to reconciliation of the self, and activism is inspiring, or we think, more towards accountability. And I think when we talk about like successful stories, you bring in both aspects of the equation to the table. And I think the one case that I can think of right now that feels it's been incredibly eye-opening and heartwarming is one of a woman I'd met a couple of years ago in Gambia. I was working still at The Hague, and we were having, this event with members of parliament, and this activist, she wanted to come to our event, and she couldn't. Anyways, I had heard about her because I knew she was advocating for putting an end to female genital mutilation in her country. That was still allowed, and it was a very prominent and terrible practice, and it was very much ingrained in religion. You couldn't be basically every other white person that tried to go to the country and tell them off. It failed because you didn't understand the social fabric that was sustaining that practice. So I was talking to her, this amazing, fascinating woman. We were recording a podcast, actually. I wanted to record a podcast with her, and she was telling me her story. She obviously had suffered female genital mutilation, and it was only when she left the country to study in London that she understood what had happened to her, when she saw herself through the eyes of the non-Gambian women and men. And when she realized that it was actually, against her integrity as a human, she came back to the country and started doing advocacy for both accountability and reconciliation. And obviously, like, I couldn't continue recording the podcast. I was crying myself because I couldn't believe she was telling me all these terrible things. But when I see her up to today, and she's still like, working around these issues, I think she's done such a wonderful job, because she understood I'm not going to get anywhere by simply trying to, lobby the government, or simply trying to tell the families what you're doing is wrong. I need to be smarter. So she has engaged in so many dialogues with different members of the community, at the same time as advocating for, a better legal and policy system. And I think she's been very successful in it. I haven't talked to her since, but it seems that way.
Yeah. Yeah, I love this because I feel like it puts a lot of the power on the will of the person rather than just putting all of the power on government or policy to change. And like you said, with this third wave of feminism is the ability to have these conversations that are really important and to kind of say what no one else is saying. And I feel like it's more difficult when it gets to not person to person and when it gets to the internet, because there's that anonymity. There's not looking each other in the eyes and feeling each other. There's this sense that we can attack more. There's also the fact that on Twitter there's like a you can only do a certain amount of words, so it's like it has to be a very concise message, and all of these factors which don't really get us to properly hear each other. And I think that's a lot of the reason why there's a lot of slander on the internet. The beautiful part is the fact that so much information is available. The downside to that is so much of the information is complete bullshit. So, yeah, I would love to hear also from you about this age of information and the way in which you've seen information used through a feminist lens that gets people involved in a dialogue versus what we see sometimes with cancel culture, where it's just attack instead of this two-way relationship of listening.
Yes, cancel culture is it's a polemical discussion to have. Again, that I think perhaps my stance on it, even being considering myself a feminist, is not that well accepted. I think cancel culture misses the point. I don't think it works for many reasons. So, like, obviously, cancel culture is we have a person and that person has allegedly, been involved in some sort of misconduct against women or other minorities, and then that person usually is, popular on the media, and then we decide to, actually it's like companies that have the power to do so decide to censor them, right? Like to stop broadcasting their content and so forth in a form of like response to that misconduct. And I think it misses the point because, number one, I think it is not allowing for okay, let me backtrack. The first problem is I think we can compartmentalize people versus the things they produce. I want to believe that we have a capacity to not be so dogmatic in just simplifying reality so much that a misconduct of a person equals that everything that person is trying to say or produce or share should be is tainted. I don't think we're doing each other a favor or a service. The second problem is that when you cancel that person or the expression of that person in certain outlets, you're not allowing for that person to redeem themselves. And like, what are we trying to do, right? Are we trying to achieve just punishment, or are we also seeking redemption? And I would prefer, that we're seeking redemption. And then the third one, like most important one, is I don't think it eradicates the idea at all. That is the most important one. So like if what the person did is usually an expression of a much more systematic and widespread sentiment, usually also through generations. Just by canceling that person's expression in media outlets, it won't make the feeling disappear. If anything, I think it helps it propagate. And this is nothing new what I'm saying. I think it's like an ongoing discussion. So that's what I think. It's missing the point. Although I do understand, some people say, to counter what I just said and playing like devil's advocate, they will be like, in social media, it's so easy to spread misinformation and hate. It's just like instant communication, right? It makes it spread like fire. Then the problem is not necessarily with like, cancel culture. The problem is our relationship to technology to begin with, right? If the problem is that inflammatory pieces of content can spread that fast, then we need to first and foremost rethink our relationship to technology and to communication more fundamentally, I would say.
Yeah, so you touched upon multiple things that are interesting, and I think the most interesting point in our methods of communication, especially when there's a great deal of hurt and pain and we want accountability and we want change, is the easiness in kind of thinking that if we erase a person from a narrative, it erases the problem. And that's, as you said, it's not the way it works. And another part of it is, what do we actually want from other beings in general? Do we want them to just suffer? Mm-hmm. And or do we want change? And then what is something that catalysts change in that way? And yeah, it's interesting when technology gets involved and human emotions are just like raging fire, and the fact that we are rewarded for it. That's the hardest part also, is that the more provocative you can be, the more hateful you can be, the more you're actually getting attention online. And I feel like we've seen this with many different types of personas. One thing that's interesting to me is the way what we hate, we fuel, in a sense. Mm-hmm. I remember one of the big contemporary day talks is about this Andrew Tate guy. And the way, I would see on some feminist platforms this reposting him, but then it's like, fuck this guy, blah, 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 blah. Oh my God, he's, so horrible. And they're sharing actually his information. And it's just like this snowball that's picking up more and more snow the more it's riding downhill. And interesting in the way in which we can try to exile something, but it doesn't exile the problem itself. And based on the work you've done in policy and then also working in tech, so both of these fields you're super familiar with, let's bring it back to the personal, because we're both women. We've both probably been in situations, me, myself, I've been in situations where I was almost raped. I have many friends who were raped. I have many women in my family who are abused. When these things happen, what do you feel is a way to get justice? To get justice, but allow the person to redeem themselves, allow the person to not just be reduced to that one action, but also to have that sense of accountability and fairness for women, because this is a wound that we have all suffered generationally.
That's a good question. It starts within first, I would argue. The funny thing, or it's not actually funny, it's tragic, but the irony is that, for example, I'm 31. I've been working in the space around human rights for a long time. I feel that I am a fierce advocate. Yet, even up to now, even up to very recently, I've been put in a situation where at work, in a work environment, I was drinking alcohol one evening, and there was this person who holds a position of power, and then he made this uncalled for sexual advance, very uncomfortable to hear or to receive. And I didn't tell anyone. I think initially I thought, did I provoke this man? Like, was I flirting with him? Seriously, it took me a couple of days to realize that I was blaming myself for something that deep down I knew I had not done. And even so, it is absolutely not an excuse to harass someone. So that to say is, unfortunately, we as women, we carry the guilt and the shame that passes on from our mothers and the mothers of our mothers. And that is such a pervasive thing that lives within us. So the first thing is to sort of, there's no other way but training yourself into identifying this guilt and trying to get rid of it, so you can see when you have been in a situation of violence, is in a situation of violence based on your gender identity. Once you've seen it, I can continue with the same example because I think it illustrates the point very well. Like in this particular case, I told some friends about it, and it was amazing to see that they also had been put in by the same man in a very similar situation. And we all realized, oh shit, this is actually okay. This is actually happening. So this person is being, this person is being completely inadequate and has predatory tendencies. What are we going to do about it? So we got in contact with the organizers of the work event that was like a week long. And then the first thing we did was to put together a letter explaining what had happened without necessarily mentioning the person, but explaining what had happened, explaining the meaning behind it, explaining why we consider it's wrong, explaining the values that we, see ourselves living and working through. And we share them with the community at large that had been involved in that event. And, I think it hasn't happened yet, but then a follow-up action was or would be to talk privately with this person and, start by giving a warning, a very, very clear warning. And then if the person makes the same mistake again, it's like, obviously then actions need to be taken to sanction that behavior. But in the first, it's like in this particular case, because of how it unfolded, right? And because that's what we felt, the women that had been in the other side of the violent act, we said, okay, first let's bring awareness onto what happened to the community at large. Then let's approach these person individually. And then let's make very clear that this cannot happen again. And even if it did happen and that person was excluded from the community, we need to put together measures to prevent this from happening again in the future. And it was great and wonderful, because when we sent the letter, many people said many inflammatory things to the letter. And we had what I described in the beginning, reactions and saying, why should we be educating these men on things that are so fucking obvious? Like, we're first of all being the victims of violence or unwanted sexual advances, and then we also have to educate them. This is bullshit. Like, I don't want to do it. And that is valid. I think we can decide what we want to do. But I myself thought, like, actually, no, this is cool. Like, let them come and say, what they have to say, and let's engage in conversation. Tell me where your pain is coming from. Tell me where your pain is coming from. I want to listen. Tell me, what did you think that me sitting down and having had a drink was an invitation for you to tell me to go to bed with you, when there was clearly not the place or the time to say so, and you didn't leave when I said that I didn't want to, right? Who told you that that is the way to initiate intimacy? Can we talk about sex? Can we talk about intimacy? So I think, like, this is a very controlled environment to describe sexism. I would say it's not, you have different levels of sexism that make it more or less blatant. They're all harmful, but so in this case, I think that is a way to address the situation in a more like holistic manner to prevent it also in the future.
Yeah, one thing that you brought up is not letting what happened to you just live inside you. And so going there and speaking to women, basically, and then realizing that they were actually going through the same thing. Bell Hooks has a lot of really beautiful books around feminism. And one point she talked about was how women have gotten this stereotype of being gossipy, or like what gossip is. And she talks about how this kind of at the office water cooler talk of women being by the water cooler and speaking to each other is actually a form of solidarity and safety, because it feels unsafe to go straight to your manager who's a man who might not listen to you, but to go to the women and to speak. And so she argues that a lot of what was perceived as gossip in the workplace was actually talking about different subjects with women to feel safe, because you just can't go directly straight to the man. And
Absolutely.
yeah, and this is a really great point you brought up, and then the fact that it didn't happen to just you. And that's the thing also with so much of our pain, with so much of yeah, sexual assault, sexual violence, all these things is that they live inside of us, and that's how the shame collects and builds. And when we have the strength to yeah, speak to other women, there's this sense of parochial empathy and like, okay, actually I've been through that too, and let's face it together. And another great point you made is this sense, and it's really difficult sometimes, but the sense of almost like curiosity to understand, like, oh, this is actually what you think connection is. That's an issue. You think connection is barely speaking to me and asking me for sex. Why is that okay? And why is that okay to do in a professional environment? And to ask these questions and not to just say these blanket statements. We've both learned about nonviolent communication with Marshall Rosenberg, but this staying away from the "you are" statements, like "you are a creep, why would you do that?" But this sort of questioning, this curiosity to understand, and it's important.
Yes, and I think it is crucial also to put forward that it's a lot of work. I'm not. Yeah. Also speaking, I've also suffered or been on the receiving end of violent acts, all the way from sexual abuse to more subtle ways. Even last night, talking about this podcast with close friends, you can feel on that receiving end of violence, and sometimes you just don't have the energy to undertake this exercise, and that is totally fine. And like I said, sometimes you really do need a more harsh and prompt approach to disrupting the violence that is being spread around. But I think there is still a value in having the hard conversations. We have to have the hard conversations. What is intimacy, right? What is sex? What is sensuality? What, like, is a naked body always equal to you in your mind as an invitation for you to approach me, for example, like in terms of like nudity and sexual, like it's important that we're engaging in these conversations. So that's what I thought. It's something that we have to keep in mind for whenever we're ready to fight that fight.
Yeah, yeah, and you bring up a great point in the fact that it's almost knowing which fights to choose. And this is sometimes the issue I have with a lot of Gen Z is, and I'm on the cusp of Gen Z. I'm like 4 months older than most Gen Zs, but there's this feeling of hypersensitivity and kind of everything is a fight. And this, I think, is a huge wastage of energy. And I feel like identity politics are important, but at a certain point, there's so much focus being put on really trivial things that our attention is kind of turned away from more prevalent issues. So like you said, it is knowing when you have the energy, what fights are worth fighting for, what conversations are worth being engaged in. And it's also reading the other person. It's also knowing where they are in their consciousness to even have that conversation. There's some people that I would love to have, certain talks with, but I'm like, they're probably just not going to change, especially if you see that the behavior is so deeply repetitive that they don't want to change. And this is where I think, yeah, accountability comes in. Also, I'm super interested. So you working in these male-dominated spheres as a woman, I have also had just sprinkles of it working in technology for a bit and then also going to a competitive business school with mostly men. And there was this feeling a lot of the time, and I don't know if your experience is the same, but I can just say one, where I'm in a group setting and we have a project we need to execute, to plan, to work on. And it's me and 4 men. And I give the strategy immediately. I'm like, okay, this is what I think we need to do. And they're like, I don't know about that. And then they're talking and they're talking and it's not really going anywhere. And then someone says the same exact thing I said at the beginning. And they're like, yeah, let's go for it. That's great. And it's this feeling, this is just a small example, but there's this feeling of being almost not listened to or not having the same authority that men command often. And when you are in these male dominated environments, what is the way in which you feel you have the confidence to get your message heard, your voice across, to kind of command this attention instead of just letting men always lead the way and following?
I think I feel it's a day-to-day battle. It's just recently when I transitioned from working in advocacy in The Hague in these sort of international organizations and NGOs environment to academia, that I can't speak in public. I can't. It's become a problem because I think I felt all the insecurities around me, both that have been, brewing at a personal level, but are also systematized, like sort of living in society because of being a woman, come up to the surface. And it's funny because in academia is where I have faced the least of those sort of more like subtle sexisms, as opposed to the first environment that I just described. So let's say the first thing is, I believe it in any hierarchical organization, the situation you're describing will always be more prominent. So I think we need to be aware of the environments in which we're working. And if we see that we have very strict hierarchies, we need to be prepared for dealing with it more than if it is more horizontal. That is a feeling that I have. And then it's a matter of calling it out when it's happening. It's a matter of knowing how it can emerge, which is, as you're explaining, right? It's like not acknowledging when a woman is talking, not even paying attention to what she has to say, repeating the same thing, and because I am being a man, is taken seriously. So it's like, okay, this is a hierarchical organization. I think that because I am a woman, I might be neglected in all these ways. And then unfortunately, right, I'm saying at a personal level because it's putting all the burden on us, but still is what we have control over. Prepare ourselves to fight against it. And a good way is simply, is interrupting. It's been, can you please let me finish my sentence if they're talking on top of you? Simple as that. Is fighting for due recognition of authorship of ideas, right? It's something that I can't do even up to now. I am very uncomfortable asking people to give due recognition to things that I have produced myself. What else is, not working for free. It sounds obvious, but it's not. It's like my time is just as valuable as it is yours. And I want to be paid not only the same, but I want to be paid with the same methodology you're paying men. If I'm putting extra hours, I also want to be rewarded for those. I am not the errands person in this organization, for example. And, finally is being non-apologetic about our bodies too. And I think this is a very important point. So for us to say we need equal rights and equal opportunities, it also involves acknowledging that people live in different bodies, in different biological bodies. And the fact that some bodies menstruate and have their cycles and that cannot operate on a 24-hour basis like other bodies is totally legitimate and doesn't make you weaker or less. And you being blind to that is just doing a disservice to your individuality. So it's part of being true to yourself is acknowledging that at times you will have to rest and at times you will be able to work more, and that is totally fine. And and sort of making people aware in your organization that that is the way that you can perform, and changing the mentality from like a very male dominated way of production towards a more diverse way of producing. So those are like some of the points that come to mind.
Yeah, all really beautiful. One that I want to bring up because you just touched upon it is this sense of our value intrinsically and what we actually demand from work, not just what work demands from us. And so valuing of time, and then also valuing of our energy. And what I've noticed is women in work environments a lot of the time are getting asked more than men for certain things. You just touched upon this by saying like, I'm not going to do your errands. Like I've noticed in a lot of work environments, it's like you're doing all the work, but also you're the only one to go and grab the coffee. You're the only one to go and
Taking
and do
notes.
this. Yeah, taking notes. That's a huge one. And actually what's so powerful in those situations is saying no. Yeah,
Oh
and
my
I feel
God.
like this is something that is so not part of what has been constructed in the female psyche, which is this over giving, which is the divine mother that will always be there, that will always provide, that will always, stretch beyond her capabilities. And there's something so powerful in no. There's something so
Oh my
powerful
God.
in what you said, like, don't interrupt me, I'm not finished speaking. Like these really assertive statements, and the way being assertive can often get you called a bitch, but it's actually if a man did the same thing, it's being assertive. And so the way in which we can be assertive without being aggressive, but just stating exactly what's going on, which is like, if it's a no, it's a no, and I don't have to pretend it's a yes. And that goes into what you were saying with the fact that we are in these bodies that do have a cycle. We have our periods, which is a inner winter. It's a time for rest and restoration. And to be pushing myself with brute force is not going to do any of the company or the system or whatever I'm in a service. It's going to do a disservice in the end. And so it's so difficult being in these places that are male dominated, because it almost forces you to I don't know how to say it gently, but to become like a man. Yeah.
No,
And
absolutely.
yeah. And I don't want to be. And I think that's also why very quickly I was like, I'm not working in technology, because a lot of it from what I was doing was just complete bullshit. But secondly, it was like, I don't like the way I'm turning, because there's a point where it's what you said. It's knowing that in certain ways you will be neglected. In certain ways, there will be a lack of understanding. And then the question is, in what way can I shape my persona or my way of being to adapt to this environment? Or how can I work to make the environment adapt to me or work for me? And yeah, that's an interesting question in itself. Is, have you seen kind of subtle plays of making these environments softer or more gentler just with the presence of you being a woman in them?
I think I've I've been witnessing a change for many years now, a very interesting one that I think fits within the category of people designing post-capitalist futures. I think that's a word that you also used in one of your podcast episodes that I adored, and I listened to it like a million times. And the core of it is acknowledging that in capitalism, economy is designed through the male gaze. And what you're saying before, I don't want to become a man. It's something I went through, and I'm still trying to disengage from. It's so important that we realize, particularly the women born in the 90s, I feel, in Catholic countries. I don't know if we have data to back this up. This is a feeling, but I think we were born feeling we were deserving of love so long we were doing. And that's where the stereotype of the independent woman came from. It lives in me, very much so. And it was only when I was in touch with people with, again, tantric perspectives, when I arrived to Kopangan, that I realized, and I've said this a million times before, I thought of myself as a feminist, and I realized that the only thing that I was doing is trying to be a man. So it's like, there's nothing less feminist than just trying to be a man, right? And it was such a shock to realize it, because I gave myself no opportunity for rest or regeneration, and I felt completely undeserving of love if I wasn't doing, just by being. So it took me a long time to let that sink into my body. Like, what are you talking about? When they were saying to me, you need to work on your feminine energy. I was like, that is such a sexist remark. And then I was like, oh, fuck, wait. I understand what you're talking about. I need to work on my surrendering and receiving and enjoying. And I do, because I'm constantly burned out and exhausted. And I don't want to operate like a man because, or with that energetic configuration, because it doesn't feel good in my body. And I think that realization that I had at an individual level is happening in so many women and men and non-binary beings alike, understanding those two core energies that operate in us, the masculine, for lack of a better word, and the feminine, and how we can play with them in our favor as opposed to being ruled by them to, the point of exhaustion. And you can call it like leading from the feminine in the workspace as one of these expressions that I'm seeing, which is leading, producing with curiosity and compassion, right? It's like penetrating the economy with curiosity and compassion, which means we're taking more time in the process as opposed to trying to ship fast and just produce as fast as possible, just to put it very simply. But is a care and is a slowing down of the meanwhile, as opposed to being only focused on efficiency, which leads, to extractivism, which leads to the problems that we have now, is bringing in the seasons again into the workspace. Literally, there's time to produce, there's time to observe what we produce, there's times to rest, there's times to plan, and they usually may take longer than they used to take before. And it is perhaps, not measuring success in numbers, but in other metrics. So it's redesigning the grammar of the economy towards something that is a post-capitalist sizes and shapes. And I think that is bringing in that wisdom, and it's bringing in that feminine energy into, into the workplace, hopefully.
Yeah, especially because a lot of capitalism, and you brought this up, is the state of how fast can we get it and how much can we profit engineer from it. And in that way, if we treat workers in that way, they become a commodity. And this is how exploitation actually happens. Not just of being tired, but of the actual soul, which gets drained and drained and drained. And this feminine approach of leading with compassion and curiosity, but I would say really beautiful is the compassion piece, because then that is what creates actually the culture in business, and that is what starts to demand more from the way we make things, from the way we treat our workers. I remember one example of a friend I have who is a beautiful human being. She got hired for this big company, this tech company, and they didn't know what exactly they were hiring her for, because she has like a broad range of capabilities, but one of the titles they gave her was just vibe curator, because and you could say, okay, that's human resources, that's culture, but they called her the vibe curator because when she entered a room, she knew how to make the people in it, and this is paradoxical, she knew how to make them relax to the point in which good work would actually get done. So instead of being this frenetic hurry of, we need to do this, and I'm so stressed, my cortisol levels are rising, she was able to bring people to this place of feeling good about the work they were doing and relaxing in the work atmosphere to the point in which the quality of the work was better itself. And to me, this is just such a beautiful example of leading in the feminine, because she is totally not manly. She's very much herself. She's very much, feminine and womanly. And the company wants that. And they see the way in which it works, actually. And it's difficult because so much of the time we're so obsessed with short-term short-term outcomes. And yeah, leading slowly, doing less work, but actually work that is more aligned with our values, that's not exploiting other people in the company, that's not just about stress and only peak performance all the time, is actually better for the long run. And this is a huge issue I see all the time with people, and you can speak on this, is burnout, is the fact that we are working so much to the point where the work is not constructive anymore. Yeah.
Yes. Yes, it's exactly the way it feels to me now. And it's scary to think in those terms. It's also valuable that we come to senses in understanding that the economy that we live in is one that is designed to keep us enslaved. So breaking free from that is already very scary. Even more so if what we're trying to breaking free from is production and overproduction for the sake of it. But I do feel the seeds already being planted, and that is such a beautiful realization. And it can start as slow as, I give you an example, a very recent example that I got from a coach and a dear friend of mine. For instance, in public speaking, usually everyone is nervous when they're going to speak in public, right? It's very, very, very common. But the kind of male-dominated way to go about it is pretend that you're not nervous and you just rush through the conversation and you get it over with. I was freaking out when I started doing my PhD, and I had to talk at many conferences, so forth. And actually, I had to speak once in Harvard, and I completely blanked. It was just a horrible thing to happen, and I was traumatized. So I talked to this friend, and I told her what happened, and she said, why don't you, the next time you have to speak and you feel nervous, you put it out there, and not saying I think, which I use a lot, but say, oh, I feel nervous when you grab the mic, right? Like I feel kind of nervous. Let me just breathe through it. And she said, if you pay attention, if you say that, all the people will resonate with it because it's something that they must have felt before. And you're inviting the audience to, for a second, stop thinking or leading from their minds and going back into their bodies and taking a deep breath before we're starting to talk about highly intellectual topics. So even that small change can make heaps of difference in, getting to a burnout.
Yeah, the point you made that's really beautiful is this bringing it back to actually feeling, and the fact that it creates empathy in the crowd, and you can kind of see the way in which the crowd will soften with you and wants to maybe, just be there, rather than, with men, I feel there's often this brute force, or as you said, fake it till you make it. And it's in a way kind of going against reality, or the reality of which they're feeling in their body, and that pressing against it, which creates probably some kind of cognitive dissonance. And it's it's dishonest. And I feel like there's also something with when we speak our feelings, they almost dissipate. It's like you put awareness on it, like, oh, actually I'm feeling really nervous, and then after breathing for 1 minute, you're like, oh, okay, I'm not that nervous anymore. And it's gone. And I noticed it, and now it's not there anymore, as is the nature of reality.
And that's but that is back to cancel culture, where I think is, okay, you don't want to talk about it. It's going to spread. On the contrary, it's very counterintuitive, right? But let's definitely speak about it. Let's talk about it. Don't cancel these people out. Let's have the hard conversation. Easier said than done if you are not in the, again, receiving end of the inflammatory comment. But it's for the same reasons that you're just describing.
Yeah. I would like to end this conversation with a question for you. And what has been, I feel like so much of the way we learn in life is through watching examples of people accomplishing the things we want to accomplish, doing the things we want to do. People who have just their way of being speaks to us. Can you speak on a woman that you've met or maybe just a woman in general who really inspires you in the way in which she remains in the feminine, but is still a part of life, of capitalistic system, of work?
I would say I would say the two founders of the firm that I'm in, their names are Beatriz and Aviva. They're incredible, fascinating, strong women. They decided to start the firm a couple of years ago, 2018, because they were tired. They were seeing that if they were able to be decision makers ever in the industry or in the space, it was going to take us years because of the way, international peace and security and development are structured. So they were like, fuck it, we're going to start our own business. And so they did. And they're fierce and go-getters, but they've always treated me and other members of the firm as family, with an open and warm heart. And they're very, very aware of, the intricacies of life, of the complexity of what we're doing. So I've always been amazed by how they can mix and combine both energies so elegantly. So I would say those are my two examples of how you can get it done.
And that's beautiful that your examples are actually the founders of your company, so people you're working with probably on a daily basis.
Yeah, unfortunately, not so much now because of my PhD, but I still like every now and then I jump into the conversations, and it's so beautiful to see the way that they have created this culture, right? Of even like talking about mental health issues, that we have channels dedicated to that. And it's a for-profit business that is trying to penetrate the world through an intersectional feminist lens. It's not doing charity, but the culture of the company, of the collective, is one of, again, where compassion and curiosity still exist, and that is so beautiful.
And is there anything you feel we didn't touch on, or anything you want to leave viewers with? Any message?
I feel a good way to end the conversation is to, I'm going to ask you a question, actually. Much about feminism is about feeling empowered, and that is a good reminder of why feminism is a powerful narrative. So I wanted to ask you, what does empowerment feel like to you? Real empowerment.
Yeah. I feel like for most of life, I like to navigate life from this inside out model. So to put less focus on just external environment, but more on the sense of me. So it's not this extracting power through, but this, coming from the inside out. And what makes me feel the most empowered is the ability to, it's so obvious. It's almost boring. It's so obvious. But the more I can understand and know myself, the more empowered I feel. The more I am aware acutely of my inner processes, the more I am in a dialogue with the different bodies inside me, emotional, spiritual, psychological. There is a feeling that I cannot be pushed and pulled so much by other people, or by like the way I used to feel angry, like so angry about the systems in place, and rightfully so. I just don't feel it as much anymore, because I'm really coming from, like I said, this more inside out approach to life. And yeah, I feel empowered when I know what I want. I feel empowered when I know exactly what I don't want. I feel empowered when I am able to properly articulate and express what lives inside of my head. And that is the opposite sometimes of people pleasing. That is sometimes the opposite of being nice. Sometimes it's the opposite of this. We talked about the divine mother just giving and giving, because sometimes I can't. And it requires a kind of honesty. And I think that's what makes me feel the most empowered, is being honest with myself. And there are times where it's difficult because it's easier to live in delusion. And yeah, that's the best way I can answer it. Yeah, the more and more I can get to this place of truth.
That's beautiful.
Yes.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, and I just want to say I'm so happy about this conversation. I've been wanting to have it for so long. I've been wanting to get to know you as a person more and more, because I see your power and I see your beauty, and I'm excited for us to reconnect in Thailand and actually to do a podcast in person. This would be great.
Yes, let's do it. And I see you too, sister. Thank you for this opportunity.
Yes. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.